Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Agronomy and Action Insight series. We are very excited that you have joined us for our second of 6 webinars in the overall series this winter. Our goal with the series, of course, is to bring impactful information to help you on your operation and improve your corn and soybean performance out in the field. Today, we'll be covering a topic on soil health activation. Assess, adopt, measure, and repeat. Before we jump into the actual content of our presentation, I have a few housekeeping items that I want to make sure we cover. First off, we are recording today's session. We will be making this available anywhere from 7 to 10 days following this event on our landing page for Agronomy in Action on the Golden Harvest website. Second, we will be utilizing the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So as you have questions throughout this morning's session, please go ahead and get those submitted there. We'll have ample time on the back end of today's presentation to answer the questions that you have. So please get those submitted. Now, bringing us our soil health message here this morning, we have 3 great presenters from Syngenta Soil Health team. We have Abby Wick, who is the Soil Health Academy group lead. We have Jordan Wade, who is our Soil Health Assessment group lead. And then we have Clint Truman, who is our Soil Health Sustainability lead at Syngenta. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Abby to get us started here on this soil health message. Thanks again for joining us here this morning.
Hey, great. Thank you. Good morning. So I'm really excited to have this conversation today because I think we've left plenty of time at the end for questions, as Julia said. And so I think we want to share our frame of mind when it comes to soil health and then have some discussion around that and get some input as well from you all. But when I think of soil health, and as most of our team does, we're thinking that, some of these soil health principles are a little bit ambiguous. They're kind of difficult to apply, and that creates a challenge in the real world, right? In the field where we're trying to adopt different practices around solving a problem. We're also looking at kind of this lack of, some advisor perspective. So those crop advisors that are out there working with growers, they typically haven't been included in this area of their expertise. And so what we're doing is taking a very crop advisor minded approach where we're looking at that perspective from an advisor standpoint. We're also taking the farmer input and then, our input as industry, and then also university research that's being done too, and the importance of that and looking at soil health practice adoption. So that's the challenge. So the solution, as I kind of mentioned, is to look at these soil health principles on a farm to solve farm problems. So not just applying reduced tillage for the sake of applying reduced tillage, but maybe we have a water management issue in the field and that can be solved by reducing tillage. And so really looking at what the problem is first and then stacking those tools around that problem to come up with solutions. But I know that everybody loves the definition of soil health, and I think we should maybe start with what we've come up with as a team at Syngenta on soil. And so for us, it is the continuous science-based pursuit of products and practices to harness the potential of soils to optimize grower outcomes and minimize environmental impacts. And that's a pretty long definition, but I think we've highlighted the importance, the important parts of that. The products and practices, we're using both to adopt practices or to adopt soil health. And we want to optimize grower outcomes, which Clint will talk about. And Jordan will also talk about as far as the assessment piece and then the work we're doing on farm while minimizing environmental impacts. I think every word in that definition is important, but I think if we're looking at the way we're approaching it, you can see the products and practices. We're not just adopting principles, we're looking at those specific action items to optimize grower outcomes and minimize environmental impacts. So if we are looking to apply soil health approaches to solve problems, we have to take a little bit of a mind shift. What practices could create opportunities to solve those problems? And so I think we're going to take a look here at a couple scenarios where we've applied this mind shift. Okay, this is a great one because I think, at least in the Northern Plains where I'm located, there's a lot of salinity issues. And you could relate this to any kind of problematic part of the field and how you might address it. But here, this grower had challenges with salinity. They came in and they put barley, they seeded barley in those saline areas, which is a more salt tolerant crop. And on the rest of the field, they put their soybean crop, which had a pretty decent yield. So you can see they kind of squared things off to make it easy for their equipment. They reduced tillage as well. I mean, the whole field is reduced till, but they were very aware around those areas where the barley is to not have any tillage and to use that more tolerant crop in those areas. So that's one example, right? We could do this for low pH soils. We could do this for other problematic parts of the field, but salinity was one of the examples that was pretty easy to show with this aerial photo. This other one, this is where I cut my teeth on soil health in general, working alongside a grower and the adoption of new practices. So this is again in the Northern Plains. But the field on the left is actually tile drained, which is interesting. We think tile drainage is a solution for a lot of these challenges, but you can see the water is still standing in the field. There's a compaction layer there that's inhibiting that water from moving through the soil to get to the tile lines. It's certainly intercepting groundwater. But on the right-hand side, there's no tile drainage, but we've worked on using some different soil health practices to manage that water in that field in that high clay soil. So for example, this field has cereal rye that was seeded in the fall after harvest, and then it's growing in the spring, transpiring water. Also, we're looking at some evaporation from this field and some drainage from the structure that's being built by the reduced tillage in that field. So same problem of water management, different approaches on either side. You can see how the soil health approaches might be beneficial and helpful. This is where that moment came by for this grower that he knew these practices were working. I think we always call them an aha moment. I call them that moment where everybody calls you at 9 p.m. and tells you this is working, and they sometimes can't believe it. But the field, again, this time it's a little bit flip-flopped. On the left-hand side, we have their field where they've been using cover crops and no-till for a couple of years. And then the field on the right is the neighbors where they were using full tillage, deep rippers, things like that. And this is their harvest picture. So they harvested soybean on the same day. And the farmer that was using soil health practices, you can see that he has very few ruts in the field from harvest. The combine was in two-wheel drive and he was loading his trucks in the field. So these are some of the main benefits that he's seeing of adopting soil health practices. On the right, the grower had tracks on his combine, leaving pretty intense ruts across the field, had to load trucks on the road, which is a safety concern in a lot of these areas. So I think here we're seeing that soil health practice is being used. We're solving a problem of water management in that field, and that can be very beneficial for all the logistics on the farm. So again, we're not adopting reducing tillage for the sake of reducing tillage or cover crops for diversifying rotations or to have a root growing 365. We're adopting for very practical reasons for things like logistics during harvest. And here's another example on those same high clay soils of adoption of strip till. So in this case, the problem is fertilizer placement for the crop. That was a challenge in this field. We have some excess water issues. The solution using strip till and this overwintering cover crop. So here they flew rye on into their soybean crop before harvest. And that rye was actually took hold in the field. This doesn't always happen. This isn't a reliable practice, but in this case, we got pretty lucky. And now you can see how the strips are going through that rye stand. So again, use of reduced tillage, cover crops to solve a problem in this field of fertilizer placement, excess water, and erosion. And I think this is my last example where we're going to look at sandy soil management because it's very different from the high clay soils. And here, the grower, they changed the rotation to include more short season crops on this field because of the water limitations later in the season. And then they also are using a cover crop to build up residue and organic matter in the soils. And so here you can see where they took over a new field, kitty corner to one where they've been using these practices for about 14 or 15 years. And so their fields where they've been using these practices is this no-till cover crop. You can see the darkness of the soil, which means there's more organic matter, which means better water holding capacity and more water for crops later in the season. And on the right, the conventional tillage, where you can see the color of the soil is fairly light. There's not as much organic matter. That fields, they're putting on the fast track to what they have on the left-hand side by using cover crops right off the bat and trying to get that organic matter increasing in that soil. And this is what their field looks like. They use, again, reduced tillage, use of cover crops that winter kill, and a stripper head to get even snow catch across the field. So again, some more soil health practices to manage a droughty soil where erosion is a concern because of the sandy texture and the lack of organic or residue on the surface that could be there if tillage was used. And they're building organic matter and using cover crop and no-till to do that. And Jordan, it's over to you now.
Oh boy. Okay. So I'm here to talk about kind of soil health assessment. And I think, of course, the fundamental question is, well, why should we assess soil health at all, right? Now, from a big picture perspective, right, we talked about our definition where we have these products and practices that we're bringing to kind of optimize grower outcomes, right? And Abby mentioned these kind of soil health principles here, right? Now, these are somewhat familiar. The idea here is that you want to reduce disturbance, maximize your living roots, get your soil covered, and have that diversity. And for some folks, there's the option to incorporate livestock. Now, as Abby said, that these principles are kind of abstract and they lack that grower perspective, right? And I think part of that is it's reflected that lack of grower perspective is reflected in the fact that moving from that products and practices kind of idea here to the actual outcomes that like growers care about is kind of difficult, right? So we want to take those products and practices to achieve those outcomes, to solve those problems. And it could be things, of course, you want to produce more, you want to have more stable yield. Maybe you want to have a more integrated nutrient management program, deal with pest pressure, and ultimately, of course, you want to maximize your economic kind of returns here. No one's farming for fun, it's a living. And so, we want to make sure that we are using those products and practices to advance towards those goals. But, that can be very difficult and there's no one size fits all. And so this is where soil health assessment comes in, right? Now, soil health assessment, we usually think of these as, there's a lot of different things that we can include here. But we say that soil health assessment is at this intersection of our physical components of our soil, things like structure and texture, our chemical components, pH, available nutrients, etc. And then we have this biological component. And that biological component is really kind of the new area for soil health, right? And soil health is really saying that it's not any one of these things. It's kind of all of them coming together is what's really important here. Now, okay, that's high level, but the purpose here, right? The purpose of soil health assessment is to understand how those products and practices might be helping us achieve their outcomes, right? Abby mentioned in one of those case studies that one of the farmers was using these kind of practices, no-till and cover crops, and had been using them for a couple years, and they had just started on the other field, right? Now, oftentimes it's challenging to know like if you're doing the right thing, right? It's hard to see progress. Progress can be slow. And so it can take 5 to 10 years sometimes to see the results, right? And so because of that, you're not sure if you're actually achieving that outcome or if you're on the right path or if you should kind of reconsider and pivot a little bit, right? The real question here is, should I keep using that combination? Now, soil health assessment, what we try and do is we try and have these kind of very sensitive measurements that can help you kind of course correct earlier, right? That way, maybe in 1 to 3 years, you can say, oh, this is or isn't working. This is or isn't advancing me towards my goals, right? Maybe I need to try something new or try something different or, fine tune some component here. So that's kind of the overall goal of soil health assessment is to be able to have those course corrections and direct your path kind of pretty quickly on, right? To give you that adaptive management. So not all soil health assessments are kind of created equal. And so I want to start with the cautionary tale, and then I'll end with like maybe more of a good news story. This is also, what I say is like, this is why we need to do this within Syngenta, why we can't take something off the box, or off the shelf rather. And so I used kind of one of the more common soil health measurements here, which is a Haney soil health test. And so this work was done down in Texas. So this is where Rick Haney kind of put together this test, right? This is where he developed it when he was back at ARS. And what they did is and Rick Haney was part of this study. And so what they did is they went out to this probably 70-acre field, and they did an absurdly high density sampling. Maybe every 100 feet or so, they took a grid point, right? And so you can see here on this map, these black lines here relate to different soil types. So there's a total of 4 different soil types in this 170-acre field, okay? And they captured all of that. So they really wanted to ask the very simple question of, okay, does a greater Haney soil health score actually mean that I'm going to produce more, right? And so they went out and they got the yield map, and I'll break this down for you right here because these pictures are a little less than ideal. But on the left here, we can see the color is the yield map. Green is higher yielding areas and red is lower yielding areas. Now, when you overlay that on that soil map, right, the different soil types, you can see that this soil type here generally isn't doing so well. This one here is doing pretty well. And this one on the left here is, kind of in between. And so you can see that that productivity is really kind of contingent upon the soil type. And then over here, this is their Haney soil health scores. So the blue and green are higher and the red is lower. And once again, you can see that in general, these soil types are lower. These soil types are higher, right, on that Haney soil health score. And so, once again, tracks pretty well with soil type. So, you kind of put them all together and you look at how well correlated are these things. And on the left here, you can see what happens when we just throw them all together, we bunch them all together. You can see that sure enough, there is quite a, there's a positive relationship between corn yield here and that Haney soil health score. But the story gets a little more complicated when you split it out by soil type. You see this one here is positively related, so is this one. This one here, there's not really a relationship, it's pretty flat. And this one here, it's even negative, right? And so this really points to one of the kind of watchouts, which is that, we want to make sure that we are not confusing just good ground and bad ground, right? That's not what our soil health measurement is picking up. We want to make sure that we are able to differentiate the signal here, the part that's under your control, right? And, this kind of goes back to a pretty common thing that we've all heard, since grade school. We hear it all the time, and it's that correlation is not causation. So this is an example of why that's not the case, right? A good correlation doesn't mean that it's due to that. So this is an example of per capita cheese consumption here in the US and the number of people who died by getting tangled in their bed sheets. And so you can see over time that they are pretty closely related, right? The correlation is 0.95. But the thing is, there's no plausible way that those are actually causally linked. Luckily for me, as a cheese lover, that doesn't mean that I'm actually risking life and limb here. And so similarly with soil health, just because a soil health score is positively related to productivity does not mean that it is the cause of that it is picking up the actual cause. So that means that we can't go back and actually say, hey, this is going to work, right? Like this is giving me actionable information. This is helping me solve my problem. So that's the cautionary tale, but I want to just maybe give a very quick example of how we can, a success story here. So this was a bunch of nitrogen rate trials in Ohio. And so, kind of thing we wanted to know is, all right, we've got our classic N response curve, right? As you increase your nitrogen rate, yield kind of levels off and you have your optimum somewhere in here. Now, we want to know, okay, as we change soil health somehow, how does that shift our N response curve, right? Do we have a lower agronomic optimum, right? Our lower AONR? Do we increase the ceiling, our max yield, right? Or is it some combination of both? And what we really wanted to do here is to make sure that we are focusing in on that soil health signal, right? And that we are not just getting confounded by soil type. So I'll spare you some of the nitty gritty details, but we did this across about 40 fields, and we had maybe 3 or 4 full kind of end response curves per field. And we did some associated kind of soil health sampling there. So what we were able to find was 2 things. So first off, what we found was that we got overall higher yields, right? So these soil health measurements were picking up on something that showed us that we actually were increasing our yield ceiling. But the thing is that, you know, as you get higher yields, you're going to have a higher nitrogen requirement, of course, right? And so the AONR, the agronomic optimum, actually increased a little bit too. So, you know, this is maybe not the clean story that people usually tell you with soil health. It's going to increase your yields and you're going to decrease your nutrient requirements or something like that. But it does show you, you know, that we can use soil health measurements to pick up on whether you're increasing productivity. So real quick, just quick review. 1, a good soil health assessment tells us if we're advancing towards our goals, right? Maybe productivity was the example that I used here. Up next, soil health tests aren't all equally effective. Even ones that are commonly used, sometimes they are confusing that correlation and causation. What we're trying to do here is we're really trying to hone in on that causation. Which brings me to the last one, is that soil health assessment, when done right, can give you that actionable information, right? And specifically here was on increased productivity. So that's really what we're trying to do on our team, is to keep moving the needle forward, to understand how to give actionable soil health information to solve those problems and to maximize your kind of ROI. So up next is Clint. He's going to talk about that, that economic component here.
Thanks, Jordan. I want to take just a few minutes and talk about our North America Soil Health and Sustainability Innovative Farm Network. And it's an opportunity for us to put some of this science on the ground at a field or commercial scale. And what we're really trying to do is leverage our science-based soil health outcomes and outputs to generate adoptable, cost-effective solutions to grower identified challenges and needs. So what we're really prioritizing in this network is that we're grower focused, we're going to be science based, and really what we've done to date is try to link soil health, water quality and water quantity, greenhouse gas emission, and regenerative ag practices or best management practices, with the overall goal of trying to keep products where growers put them, number 1. Number 2, keep soil and water resources on field, and then keep the agrochemicals in out of off-site areas in the environment. The other priority is that we try to increase adoption and value capture of our soil health products and practices. And when we talk about adoption, we're really talking about the sound science plus the applicable demonstration of that sound science, the impact, plus if we can demonstrate that there's a return on investment for the grower, then we've got a formula that is ideal for practice adoption. The other prioritization that we have within the network is we are very collaborative, and we put business and growers at the top of this circle for a reason. We want to make sure that we're addressing the growers' challenges and needs, whether they're agronomic, environmental, or economic. But we do work internally with our stakeholders in the CP, biological, seed space, and service space, as well as working with our soil health, digital ag solutions, computational agronomy groups. And probably most important, we work with our ASRs as well as our agri-ed specialists to make sure that we're getting this information to them so that certain decision support tools such as CropWise can be optimized. This is a map of our network. We have a farm in Georgia, one in North Carolina. We have 2 farms in Ontario, Canada, and 2 farms in Illinois, 1 in Missouri, and 1 in Colorado. And at each of these sites, we have field scale or commercial scale paired fields of conventional till and conservation tillage side by side. And what we're looking for is that comparison between adopting conservation tillage, and most of that is in the form of strip tillage plus cover crops. And then in each of those regions, we're looking at the cropping pattern that is typical of that particular region. For instance, in Georgia, it's typically a cotton peanut rotation. In North Carolina, it's a corn, cotton, soybean rotation. In the Midwest, we typically get a corn, soybean rotation. And then in Colorado, we're looking at a corn, small grain, bean, haying operation. And the tillage treatments that we've got in Colorado, we've added two treatments there. And we are continuing to look at conservation tillage, but we're looking at conventional till with and without cover crops, and also conservation tillage in the form of strip tillage, also with and without cover crops, trying to isolate individual differences. Some of the research that we have going on at these sites are looking at, again, the effects of conservation ag systems or best management practices on our soil health measurements as we compare conventional till to conservation tillage. We're looking at those 2 tillage systems and cropping systems, and how we can do a better job with our monitoring and modeling data to characterize our agrochemical fate and transport in those sustainable farming systems. Another project that we're looking at is being able to take regenerative ag practices or best management practices and look at, do our compounds have any impact on soil health and or greenhouse gas emissions? And then finally, we're looking at trying to, in the past, we've composited our soil sampling by a tillage treatment, but really what we're wanting to do now is get georeference samples and start doing some of the things that Jordan mentioned, where we're looking at causal effects between yield and profitability related to the distribution of our soil health parameters. You can look at the picture in the upper right, the top picture. You can see a picture of conventional versus conservation tillage, and the bottles in the lower corner represent what we have seen in terms of runoff and erosion. We're getting much more runoff and much more erosion from our conventional till compared to our conservation tillage. In the picture in the lower right, we stay on this water management theme, and we're very much interested in keeping water on the field, whether it be rain-fed or irrigated land, and trying to maximize infiltration, minimize runoff, and therefore we're going to impact water use efficiency as well as plant available water. And if you look across all of our sites within the integrated farm network, we tend to find that water management is a huge factor and a critical factor and challenge that all growers are facing. Another factor that we really find that we get input on in terms of challenges and needs is compaction. And the picture in the lower left shows from a penetrometer image where we took this at the LaSalle farm in Colorado. And one of the things that you see there is we have a compaction issue. Compaction limits root growth, it limits water infiltration. So it's advantageous to us to identify areas of the field where we have compaction. Compaction can limit adoption, but compaction can also limit long-term gains as we go forward. I think one of the things that we need to focus on is how compacted we have our conservation tillage systems. How do we remediate that, and how often do we need to remediate that? looking at some of the deliverables from the farm network, one of the most important deliverables is increased stakeholder interactions. Having grower and retailer interactions and engagements important. We need to be able to deliver our cost-effective solutions to their challenges and needs, but also get information back from them as they continue to go through this adoption process and soil health journey. What are some of the challenges that they're experiencing, and can we use our innovative farm network and regional based network to be able to address those challenges? We've demonstrated that with our regenerative ag practices that we can improve soil health, and that improved soil health has an impact on water quality and quantity. You can see pictures in the bottom two pictures. We got water erosion on the left and wind erosion on the right. We certainly can reduce runoff. We can reduce erosion. We can increase nutrient and water use efficiency, but we also can increase irrigation use efficiency, and have demonstrated that with conservation tillage systems, we can reduce an irrigation or two during the growing season, and that has a direct impact on grower profitability. If we manage the water correctly, we're getting the increased infiltration, we're getting increased plant available water, and even Abby mentioned that we're monitoring the change in these different parameters, especially in soil organic carbon. Finally, I would argue that we're trying to create these flexible, scalable, near real-time databases to be able to get those databases into our stakeholders, both internal and external's hands, so that we can make timely, on-farm, actionable decisions that will have a return on investment impact for growers. Finally, I think one of the most important aspects of our network is we try to have an effective outreach and visibility program where at least one site a year, we try to have a demonstration field day where we can come in and bring our internal and external stakeholders so that we can have a day of looking at some of the research that we've got going on at the field and commercial scale, and what are some of the challenges that growers have to overcome some of the things that they are experiencing, and we can have that exchange and interaction that I think is really valuable. Some of the data from the network, this is busy, but I will, as Jordan mentioned, soil health is really about physical, chemical, and biological properties. And along the x-axis, I've got an example of some of the parameters that we have measured: soil protein, respiration, active carbon, and available water content. The soil health value is a normalized value on the y-axis, so we can, in a sense here, what we're doing is comparing locations, tillages, and the soil health parameters. And each of those bars, you can see we've got are from our different locations within our network, and we can do direct comparisons of tillage and locations. That's quite valuable for us. Finally, the last slide, as Abby mentioned, soil organic carbon or organic matter tends to be important. And when you go from the previous slide to this particular slide, now we're isolating one parameter instead of looking at, what I've got on the x-axis here is the different sites and their tillage treatment. And you can see in Colorado, we've got conventional till, and Georgia conventional till, strip till, very low in organic matter content. But as you progress through North Carolina, Missouri, Illinois, we're starting to see higher organic matter contents, and then got the Canadian site there at the end. So I think this allows us then to take an individual soil health parameter and see how that varies across our network. And again, the magnitude of these values may not be as important as the change in these values or the rate of change in these values. And I think from a long-term perspective, that's what we're really trying to do, is make sure we understand the rate of change in these parameters in our different regions that are associated with this particular network. Back to you, Jordan.
Well, I think that's the end of it.
Thank you to our panelists this morning, Clint, Jordan, and Abby. Great message to bring forward to the team. We will answer any questions that you have, and we have questions coming in, so we'll go ahead and get started. An individual asked, they were at a recent meeting where they talked about the efficiencies of using cover crops and the different effectiveness based on that cover crop. Things like rye versus sun hemp, one being better than the other. What are the thoughts from this group when it comes to the cover crop that you select for your practice?
I can dive in on that one because we've used a little bit of sun hemp in the past with growers, and rye is certainly, I think, one of the gateway easy cover crops to get into, especially if you're not in wheat for seed production. I think you need to be cautious. But with any cover crop, I think it's really important to think about what's going to work in your region and for what you want to accomplish on farm. And so, so oftentimes I think of sun hemp being tried up here in North Dakota. Oftentimes it's hard to get the inoculum for it to actually get that nitrogen fixation benefit for sun hemp. And there just isn't enough time in North Dakota to see the benefits of that cover crop. So rye is one that we can see benefits. And I think if you're looking to select cover crops, look at what's being used in your region. What is going to accomplish that goal that you want to accomplish, and make sure that you're keeping the seed cost down. I think there's a lot of focus on including multiple species in a mix, and that can make it very expensive, or including some of these random cover crops in the mix that can, maybe you're not sure how it's going to perform or how it's going to impact the next crop in rotation, but definitely choose stuff that fits for your region and fits for the goals that you want to achieve.
Great. Thank you, Abby. Another clarification question that came in. Can we clarify why it would take more nitrogen to maximize yield with a healthier soil? Jordan, maybe that's to you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you're producing more crop, right? You need more nitrogen. And so, I think a lot of people like to say, oh, we can measure XYZ soil health things and decrease your nitrogen. And, sometimes yes, sometimes no. And I think that, you want to make sure that you are really testing the thing that you think you are.
Can I ask a follow-up on that, Jordan, though? Sorry, Julia, but how would you know if you can back off on nitrogen in field, Jordan? Like, what would you do? Or Clint, maybe this is to you, but how do you know that you can back off on nitrogen?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I always, encourage people to do is to try things out for themselves. So for example, choose, we'll say arbitrarily 25 pounds, right? And so try something out. If you have a field where you think you can back off a little bit, do plus minus 25 pounds, right? Put out most of your field, do one pass minus 25, one pass plus 25. You don't pay any more for fertilizer, right? Because you got 25 less in one place, 25 more in the other. You're out the same amount of money. But it tells you, like, are you leaving yield out there or profitability potentially, or can you back off, right? And so I think that's an easy way to try it out yourself.
Yeah, I would just say I'll put my grower hat on a little bit. I think I would first of all look at petroleum prices and nitrogen fertilizer cost versus what my contracted yields were, prices were, and see if it makes sense. I think sometimes producing more doesn't mean making more. So I think you got to sometimes optimize the profitability, and that sometimes may mean playing with how much nitrogen fertilizer is versus what my yields are going to be from a contracted price.
Great discussion group. Clint, let's shift gears, but I have another question for you here in the chat. When talking about the data set that you just reviewed there at the very end, how many years of comparison of tillage systems was present there?
Yeah, I think that's one thing that's probably we can tease out a little bit. Anywhere from 1 to probably 5 years is where we are with the data set that was shown, and I think it's a mix. So I think it's important to get growers where we're converting in year 1, like we're doing in the Colorado site. At the Colorado site, we've got conventional without cover, conventional with cover, strip with cover and strip without cover. So we're balancing that, and we're going to look from the day one adoption, how is that going to impact going forward? And then other sites are more mature, obviously. So a lot of that data and the differences between those two tillages are going to be driven by number of years since adoption, and that's one of the things that we definitely track. I think it's important too to, as we track those, to make sure we're communicating the expectations to growers in terms of when should they start seeing benefits. Is it year 1, year 3, year 5, year 10, and not all parameters are going to show that rate of change that you might want to see in year 1. So making sure that getting that information to growers in terms of what's managing the expectations is terribly important.
And so I think I want to pick up on what Clint just said there, because I think that there's, this is where those soil health indicators can come in, right? You might actually be making progress, but you might not see it yet, right? And so these things, the way that I've heard it phrased is they help give you the courage to keep on, right? Because you say, oh, there is something changing here, right? I am making progress. Now, as I said in my presentation, we want to make sure that we're advancing you towards the right goal, that you're making progress in the right direction. But it at least tells you that, hey, something's changing, in your soil. Like, that part is more straightforward.
And Julie, if I may, I think Abby hit on something. If compaction is going to be a problem early and often, we need to figure out how to eliminate that without having a major financial, impact on the system. The other thing that I've seen that has limited adoption is managing it relates to this cover crop, managing the amount of residue on the surface. Sometimes if you don't manage that correctly, it can be frustrating. And what we don't want is just have growers throw up their hands and say, I give. And, so I think that's where we can have demonstration sites, for instance, in the network, where we can demonstrate how to manage that crop residue on the surface or cover crop residue on the surface, as well as how to remediate compaction and how often we need to do that, because that's a major tillage event that has profitability implications.
Yeah, and there was another question that got submitted on the exact type of cover crop or cover crops that are best for mitigating compaction. Obviously, that builds on your statement of residue. In terms of actual, I guess, is there any other comments around selecting the type of cover crop for that as well for the group here?
Yeah, I think that, we typically hear about the tillage radish, right? Because it has some force behind the root. And that was some work that Ray Weil did in Maryland. And there's good research behind that to say that there is, that there's more force behind that root pushing through the soil. But I also think that we shouldn't discount the fibrous roots and their role in breaking through compaction, and then also building that soil structure that keeps us from getting compaction in the future. So things like oats or any kind of grass that has a fibrous root, that can wrap around the soil particles, form aggregates, which are basically just a combination of sand, silt, clay, some organic matter protected in there. And that aggregation is what holds up equipment in the field. And so, and if we hold up equipment in the field using our soil structure, then we have less compaction theoretically, right? So I think that, really, if that's your goal, I think include maybe some radish, but also have a high number of fibrous roots as well in that system to really get the most benefit.
Great. Let's shift gears here a little.
Oh, I want to also plug the fibrous roots. I'm in Missouri, so we have some pretty aggressive clay pans here, that are pretty close to the surface. And so those fibrous roots, especially if you're using them over time, it's an uphill battle to break that up, but it is possible, right? And especially you can't, here we can't make any more topsoil, and so you just got to work with what you got and play the hand you're dealt. And so it's a little bit of a long-term investment, but it really helps kind of smooth out the bumps when you've got a flash drought or something like that. It really can pay off. So another plug for fibrous roots.
I think, can I add another thing? I just can't stop talking. Is that I think too, when we're looking at something like a radish, it's a host for clubroot and canola. And so if you are a canola grower, you do not want to have something like that in there to break up your compaction, and you will need to use the fibrous roots. So again, choosing those cover crops based on what's in rotation and what's a host for diseases can also be really critical. Whether you want to break up compaction or not, you need to choose what's going to not, put disease in your cash crop.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great statement added to the chat as well that, deciding what this is, selecting your cover crop based on your goals, right? And each attendee here is going to have a different goal for that initial use. So appreciate that comment in the chat. Jordan, if we shift gears and we talk about soil tests and assessments in terms of analyzing our soils, we mentioned that there's a lot of different ways to go about it. If you're someone that's trying to get into this, where do you advise you start / what are your recommendations around actually understanding where your soil's at today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first off, I will just set the table with, I don't think that we have anything yet where it's like, we've solved this, right? This is a process and it's ongoing, right? And so I think that that's kind of, to be clear, that's kind of where we're at. The other thing is, the utility of certain soil tests. So I know I said, like, I had the example that a Haney test isn't fantastic, right, for predicting productivity. But there are potentially some other ones, and there's a lot of different soil labs that have offerings. I'm not going to make any plugs for any soil labs, but there are things like active carbon is one that's pretty sensitive. It changes in a year or two. And then there are other ones that maybe take a little bit longer, things like aggregate stability. You can always do, like, the classic, they have a side-by-side slate test where you just take the soil where you've been doing, say, conservation tillage, and then you take the soil where you haven't, and you just put them on some mesh and watch them dissolve and see which one dissolves faster. Things like that. I think the thing that I would encourage people to do is to try it out themselves. Another one I almost forgot. The short-term respiration is good too. That's kind of like this integrative measurement of microbial activity. So those are, a couple of my suggestions that I like that are pretty sensitive, that kind of give you a general heading. But then the other thing is, make sure that you're doing that comparison pretty responsibly, right? That you're not going from one soil type to another, even if it's within the same field. At least check yourself is, I guess, what I would say.
Thanks, Jordan. Few questions around carbon. The first is, when we analyze carbon management programs and their effectiveness on nutrient efficiencies or availabilities, are there any thoughts around, taking that carbon focus in soils from the group here?
Okay, I'll do it. I
was gonna say, we're all doing a not it here.
Yeah. So, I think that one of the things is, we have really de-emphasized carbon. There's a lot of, like, carbon markets, carbon programs, et cetera. I think, within Syngenta, we've remained a little bit agnostic about that. We've kind of stayed out of that space. So I think that we won't touch the carbon component. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. But I will say that soil health is a lot more than carbon, right? Carbon quantity is not kind of the be all end all. I loved one time I was, talking with some guys, and this guy was up in Minnesota, and he said, "Oh, I have like a 10% carbon soil, and I have like a 2% carbon soil." And he said, "Let me tell you, that 10% is not better." He said, there's all kinds of problems that it gives me when you're at these really, really high soil carbon levels. And so, I think that, like, soil carbon, if you can get $1 in your pocket from it, more power to you. We're not kind of touching that. But, like, don't always assume that more carbon is inherently better, right? In the same way that, like, if I eat more calories, that's not necessarily always better, right? You want to make sure that you have the right mix. I don't want to get all sugar. I want to have sugar, fats, and proteins, that kind of thing. And so similarly in soil, not all soil carbon particles are kind of created equal, right? We want to get the right mix of both quantity and quality. And I think that's where some of these soil health measurements are really trying to get at, is more getting at the quality component as opposed to just the quantity. We've known about quantity stuff for a while, right? Organic matter, soil carbon, those are really familiar measurements to people. We're trying to get to the next level of understanding and actionability.
Thank you, Jordan. We'll shift gears again and go back to Clint around the network and the research that we're doing. Are we looking to expand that footprint in terms of where we're testing and doing some of these trials? And are we looking for stakeholders in any other geographies to support this expansion?
Yeah, I mean, there's been discussion about where we go next, right? And so we, Abby, Jordan, and our team, we're global in nature. So the idea would be to expand the network in North America first. And we've considered the Mid-South, California. Really, a high priority on my list would be the Pacific Northwest, and demonstrate the value of the network. And then at that point, can we take that concept and go to a different global region, LATAM, APAC, that type of thing. But I think certainly where we have a footprint and where we have different major production geographies, we need to have a site there. And the other thing that I would say is within Syngenta, we have other networks, Living Grow, Grow More sites. We can piggyback on with those and provide that field scale, commercial scale, side by side comparison where we get a synergistic effect with the effort that we've got going on. But if I had to predict, and we're looking for sites currently, we're really looking hard at the Pacific Northwest at this point.
Thanks, Clint. Another question from a individual from North Dakota, in a soybean, corn, and wheat rotation. They have a question around ryegrass in soybeans when combating IDC. Obviously, there's a concern for the host of wireworm with ryegrass. Thoughts around kind of that, the use of ryegrass on combating IDC?
I wonder who this grower is. I bet I know him. I think I think there's been some great research through North Dakota State University and University of Minnesota on on using a cover crop with soybean to help manage IDC. And I've seen some growers do that and it's worked really well. It also helps manage weeds at the same time. And so I think there's double benefits to it. But I don't love the use of ryegrass. In the Northern Plains is a challenging one to use. I think there get to be so many different types of ryegrass seed in that mix that sometimes the termination can be challenging. So I mean, I don't know. Again, it's picking what you can manage for a cover crop. In some regions, ryegrass probably works great, and you just, you know, if your neighbors are using it and you're seeing success, if you're seeing university put out information on those, or you're seeing it used, you know, cover crop used at our farm network, then you can maybe have a little bit more confidence in that use of that cover crop.
Great. Thanks, Abby. We are coming near the end of our hour this morning. I appreciate everyone that has stuck with us and has listened to this Q&A. It's been a really great discussion. I just want to open it up to the panelists here and see if you have any final thoughts before we wrap this morning.
Yeah, I guess I just want everyone to think of soil health as a tool, not as a principle, right? Using the practices that fit within soil health in general, the reduced till, use of cover crops, diversifying rotation, use that as a tool to solve a problem on the farm. And I think if we focus on that, those are things that we can do and that are very tangible and less abstract. And so I think, you know, sometimes where we get stalled in soil health is because it feels like it's too much, or I can't do the whole 5 principles, or I can't do it on every acre. And it's really just important to get started and figure out what that is and what goal you're going to achieve with it, what problem you're going to solve. That would be my takeaway.
I'll go next. I think start small. If you're just take the baby steps, and I think that's what Abby mentioned. And you know, you can take it's all about management, right? You don't go from conventional till to a very highly managed system in overnight. And so take those steps slowly and wisely and methodically. I would, as a grower, I would say if you use your soil test data that comes back to help you at least initially start looking at changes that you might see in terms of improved soil health. There's a wonderful place to start, and it can give you some initial data that would help. There's I would say incentive programs and incentive practices sometimes are a little bit misleading. They should incentivize the commitment to soil health and commitment to the practice and to the system approach, opposed to just because oftentimes what we see if the incentive goes away, the practice goes away. So I would say be committed and start small.
All right, I guess I get to round it out. And so, kind of building on what they said, I think the thing that I would add is that, if you take better care of your ground, like it can, pay dividends for you. Now, the way to do that, is a process that we're all kind of on together. And, and we're looking forward to kind of helping folks navigate that, but it is possible. And I think that's the thing that I want folks to take away.
Thank you, panelists. I appreciate your time and commitment to joining this group of growers and our Golden Harvest team to talk through a very important topic that comes up a lot. But that concludes our webinar. So thank you to our panelists. We will be back next Thursday. Our topic next week will be around our agronomic research team and the research we're doing in local geographies to answer a lot of more questions that you as growers, as farmers have in the industry. So appreciate the time this morning. That concludes our time together this morning, and I hope you have a good and safe Thursday. Thanks, everyone.